Kingston upon Hull is a northern coastal town built on the industries of shipping and seafaring. It's a town epitomised by its friendly inhabitants and hard-working culture. But in 2003, a tragedy was to unfold here that would devastate a family and leave detectives shocked and sickened.
We felt that there was something sinister happening here and we had to deal with it at the highest level from the very beginning.
In the early hours of New Year's Day in 2003, one family's dreams for the future were transformed into nightmares.
I had a really bad feeling during the night when I was sitting on my own. I can never ever explain it, but I worried that the worst had happened.
Orchard Park, a quiet suburb of Kingston upon Hull and home to Ray and Wanda Moran and their two youngest children, John and Rachel. Close-knit and caring, the Morans only ever wanted the best for their children.
It struck me as very down-to-earth, honourable people.
21-year-old Rachel was the apple of her mother's eye.
She was the youngest in the family and we were older parents. I mean, I was getting towards 40 when she was born. And yet we allowed her to indulge us in a way because it made you feel that you were still young.
Rachel was a home bird, always keen to be close to her family.
Even when her best friend went to work abroad, she was horrified at the thoughts of joining her because she never wanted to go away.
And when Rachel moved in with her first serious boyfriend, Mark, she still visited her parents every day.
It was nice to know that when she finally did move out, she hadn't really moved that far. She was really only maybe 3/4 of a mile down the road.
Overall, Rachel was happy, and as 2002 drew to a close, she had big plans for the year ahead.
She wanted to be a chef. That was the thing she was most keen at, and she was going to go back to college in the new year and take up catering.
But Rachel's dreams of a new career would never be fulfilled. In the weeks leading up to the Christmas holidays, Rachel and Mark had acquired 2 kittens.
The kittens were like her children, and she was quite possessive and protective of them.
And as the holidays approached, Rachel and Mark formulated a plan to make sure the kittens were well looked after.
Cats are pretty independent and you could leave them in a room for a couple of hours and there wouldn't be any great hardship. But she felt as if they needed someone with them that night.
The couple decided that Rachel would stay in the flat with the kittens over Christmas, whilst Mark visited his mother. In return, Mark would then stay in on New Year's Eve so that Rachel could go out with her brother John.
I seem to remember Mark didn't have any money at the time, so he didn't particularly want to be out all night and was happy to look after the cats for New Year's Eve.
So as dusk fell on the evening of Tuesday the 31st of December 2002, Rachel joined her elder brother John in celebrating the new year at a local pub.
I was just delighted that she was going out with him. I wanted the two of them to do something together, and I thought a girl of 21 should be going out and enjoying herself.
Rachel had a good night. She'd enjoyed herself. She'd made some new friends. Midnight came and went, much like any other sort of New Year. They had the countdown, sang Auld Lang Syne, and we stayed in the pub perhaps for another hour after that.
It was only about 1:15 and I was still up reading when they both came home. John went upstairs immediately because he'd had a good few drinks and he was really jolly and happy, and he got himself ready for bed. I asked Rachel, was she going to ring Mark up and wish him a Happy New Year?
However, when Rachel called the flat, she was surprised that Mark didn't answer, and so she tried ringing his mobile telephone.
It was answered by a mutual friend of theirs, and Rachel could hear a party going on. And as it happens, after Rachel had left on the afternoon to come here, these friends had phoned Mark and told him that they were having a party in the house, asked would he like to come.
But Rachel wasn't happy.
I think she was upset and frustrated, mainly about the cats, but partly because she couldn't have a proper conversation because his mobile ran out of money. And there was no way she could speak to him after that.
Annoyed and concerned for the welfare of her kittens, Rachel made a decision.
I just thought she was getting ready for bed. And she came down, and when she got to the door, I heard her say, "Bye then, Mum." And so obviously I shot up and said, "You know, where are you going?" And she said she was going home.
Wanda followed her daughter out of the house.
It was really, really cold and windy and rainy, and I said to her, "You know, you can't go home at this time. You don't normally walk home on your own." And she said, I have to go because there's no one there and the kittens are alone."
Since it was New Year's Eve, taxis were scarce, and so Wanda pleaded with Rachel to stay.
And she sort of got a little bit exasperated with me, I think it was.
No matter what Wanda said to her daughter, Rachel had decided to take the mile-long walk back to her own flat.
I had just gone as far as I could with excuses and reasons, and there was nothing else I could say. And even as she was walking several yards ahead, I still shouted, "Ring me as soon as you get home." And she turned round and said, "Yeah." She said she would.
But Wanda would never hear from Rachel again. When Rachel Moran left her parents' house in the early hours of Wednesday, the 1st of January 2003, her mother Wanda had no idea that she would never see her youngest daughter again. Rachel had promised to telephone her mother on arrival at her flat, but when Wanda heard nothing after half an hour, she became concerned.
I tried her mobile and it just kept ringing and ringing and ringing and cut out. So I tried ringing her house and there was no reply. And then I tried again about 10 minutes later, and I tried quite a lot of times then. The only thing I did think was she might have decided to go out walking and looking for Mark, in which case I did know then that she wouldn't answer the phone because she'd expect me to say, "Why aren't you at home?"
But after almost 2 hours of calling, Wanda decided that she had no choice but to go to bed.
I just saw no point in staying up, and I knew that I had to go to bed at some stage.
The next morning, Wanda woke up hoping for news of her daughter.
The phone woke me up and I ran downstairs thinking it was Rachel, and I was totally relieved. And instead it was our other daughter, Vanda, just ringing to say Happy New Year.
And Wanda was now faced with having to explain to her husband Ray and their son John what had happened the previous evening.
She told me very shortly after I got up that Rachel had gone home the night before, and that she had tried to call her to make sure she got home all right, and she couldn't get through to her. At that point, I tried to call her house phone and her mobile phone and couldn't get through to either.
The family were worried.
By that morning, her mobile just said, "We are unable to connect you."
But then the family received a sign of hope.
And John said there's someone there because the landline is engaged. So I tried about 5 minutes later and Mark answered the phone. And I just, oh God, I was so relieved. And I said, "Oh, Mark, is Rachel there?" And he said immediately, "Well, no, she's not here. She was staying with you last night, wasn't she?"
Mark went on to explain how he had been at the party all night and, after returning home about 7 a.m, he had gone straight to bed.
As far as he was concerned, he was the last person to leave the flat the night before, and it was exactly as he'd left it.
The cats hadn't been fed, there was no food for them, they were hungry. So she's not been here.
There was no sign that she'd been there to get changed, and she hadn't slept there.
And so, of course, I just was totally horrified then.
Wanda and John went straight over to the flat and saw for themselves that there was no sign of Rachel.
I had no idea what must have happened. But of course my mind was imagining all kinds of scenarios.
Wanda feared the worst.
I said, I'm going to go to the police. It was only lunchtime, she hadn't even been gone 12 hours. And Mark was quite bemused, he thought. He said she could be anywhere, she knows lots and lots of people. But I was just worried because it was just totally out of character.
Wanda and John headed straight over to the Priory police station to report Rachel missing.
What we tend to do is look at the background circumstances to see whether there are any particular risks to that person and how vulnerable they might be. And we had a discussion, and it was very clear that Rachel was not the usual type of missing person that we get.
This was completely out of character. For her not to get in touch with somebody, not to say where she was, and for her to disappear like this, it was clear that something was very seriously wrong.
Realising there was a genuine concern for her safety, the police moved swiftly.
You cannot assume anything. So what you have to do is look at, well, what could have happened to Rachel? And there are scenarios, obvious ones. She could have had somebody else in another part of the country and was looking for a second life somewhere. She could be murdered. She could be lying in a ditch somewhere, having had an accident. The complexities of what you're dealing with are immense, really.
The detectives from Humberside Police launched a full-scale missing persons inquiry, and over 40 officers were assigned to the investigation.
When you start looking at a missing person case, you look at the people she's closest to, and on this case she was with her brother on the night time, and she'd gone back to her parents' address. So it was a brother, a mother, a father, and a boyfriend, and you look for where she could be, where she's likely to be.
Detective Superintendent Davison also asked the family to give witness statements to help them understand more about Rachel.
And I said, your father will kill me if he knows I've let you walk home on your own.
We're looking for just a fine detail, just to get an idea of where she possibly may be, or find a link that can progress the investigation on.
And I said, I can't even put you in the car because I've had a couple of drinks. She said, it doesn't matter because I'm all right.
But there was nothing apart from a disagreement with a boyfriend on the night time.
Otherwise, the only other point of interest to the police was that Wanda mentioned a passerby that might be a possible witness.
It was either fair or his head was shaved. And he was wearing a shirt in a similar colour to the blue one you're wearing today. And I must have been really worried because I immediately thought of shouting, "Are you walking up this road? Will you walk with her?" Something made me think how stupid that is. It could be anyone.
While detectives tried to trace the passerby, officers also interviewed Rachel's boyfriend, Mark.
She spends her money on clothes. Mum always buys the clothes as well. She's always coming on with new tops and stuff.
We went through the finances, we went through their history together, and built up as full a picture as we could of exactly what they were like as a couple. We knew that they'd had an argument, and we needed to make sure that we found out exactly if he had any involvement in Rachel's disappearance.
But the detectives were concerned by Mark's behaviour.
So I don't remember her talking to her either.
You don't remember talking to her at all? It's not an exact science. It's looking at a video of somebody to see whether they're hiding something, but he didn't seem at all worried or upset, which is in complete contrast to Wanda, Ray and John. Bearing in mind, they'd lived together for a long time and apparently in love and all the rest of it, so it just didn't seem right.
She wasn't having none of it, so I ended up going to my friend's house and me out because she didn't want to come. I got a bit upset with her.
Not only did Mark's behaviour seem unusual, but the circumstantial evidence was also stacked against him.
Statistics show that the vast majority of people who are murdered do know the murderer, and the general feeling was that he could be involved.
They'd had an argument that evening, and that's the reason why Rachel stormed off, very much against the mother's will. And I guess to Wanda, this was caused by the fact that Mark didn't do what he was supposed to do. If you look at it from that perspective, they wanted to know, had Mark something to do with Rachel's disappearance?
With a potential suspect identified, Detective Superintendent Davison instructed his team to re-examine Mark's alibi whilst a surveillance team monitored his movements.
What you're looking for is unusual behaviour, associations with people who may have been criminals, and building up this kind of movements to see whether there's anything suspicious.
But Mark went about his business as usual.
I've got to say that he did nothing out of the ordinary, no unusual behaviour, just went to his daily life, went to see his mother, so there's nothing at all which caused me concern.
And as the detectives verified Mark's alibi for the night of Rachel's disappearance, they began to realise it was unlikely that he was involved.
Mark was at a party till it was about 6 a.m. On Bransholme in Hull. There was lots of people at the party. We saw all the people that were there, and his account checked out. And there was nothing that made us believe that he was responsible for the disappearance of Rachel.
With his alibi proven to be true, the detectives were convinced that Mark was completely innocent of any involvement in Rachel's disappearance. But the elimination of Mark as a suspect left the detectives in a difficult position.
Once we'd discounted Mark, there was just absolutely nothing at all that we had any serious leads on. So literally, we just had no idea what happened to Rachel.
None of Rachel's clothes were missing, and records showed that neither her mobile telephone nor bank account had been used since her disappearance. So the possibility that Rachel had run away was discounted.
I wish the final conclusion could have been, yes, she's run away and she doesn't want to see any of us again. Because then, okay, well, we know what's happened, we know she's all right, but unfortunately we're not going to see her again. That would have been all right, but just not knowing what had happened would have been intolerable, really.
With no major lead to investigate, the detectives continued to explore every avenue in the search for even the smallest of clues.
It was decided to gather all the CCTV within a 6-mile radius, and that included all council CCTV, any shop CCTV, and any CCTV that people had in their own homes. So we had to gather that quickly. That was one of the urgent things we had to do.
And the detectives soon made a discovery.
We managed to recover some CCTV footage of Rachel passing a place called Jackson's, which is actually on Hull Road, which gave us the time when she would have been there and which direction she was travelling in.
Not only did the CCTV footage corroborate Wanda's account of Rachel's movements, but it also provided the detectives with a more specific location from which they could start a search.
And the search, I have to say, was massive on a scale that I've not done before. Pretty much the whole of the resources available, which would be the helicopter, dogs, horses, underwater search, we utilised pretty much non-stop from the beginning. And again, it was going outwards from our last sighting, really, which was the closed-circuit television image of Rachel.
But for Rachel's family, the searches only served to reinforce the seriousness of their daughter's situation.
When the police divers were dragging the rivers and cameras were there, I made a conscious effort never to watch the television, but Ray always did, and he got himself really upset. But I was detached from it. I just didn't want to think about it at all.
The painstaking search continued, and on Saturday, the 11th of January, the Humberside Police diving team began searching the Barmston Drain, a local canal full of household rubbish.
We went over this area several times, basically skimming the top of the surface, removing items, going over it again, digging a little bit deeper so not to disturb too much.
Amazingly, within hours of arriving at the canal, the divers recovered a vital piece of evidence.
A shoe was found, which was of a similar make and style to what it was reported Rachel had been wearing, which was obviously of interest to the inquiry.
However, the next day, the diving team was stunned when they found a lady's handbag hidden in a discarded bin bag.
The bag was fetched out of the water, brought onto the bank, and very carefully, wearing protective gloves that had been opened up and had a look inside it.
Amongst other items found inside the handbag was a mobile telephone, together with various cosmetics and hair clips. but there was one particular item that confirmed that the bag definitely belonged to Rachel.
Enclosed within the bag was a passport, which had obviously got photograph, signature and details, which referred directly to Rachel. Some other items you could turn around and say, well, it's possible it was, it's possible it wasn't Rachel's. A passport basically clinches it.
It looked to us that this had been dumped by somebody. It was in a bin liner. I think it was meant not to be found. So it was the first positive lead we'd got about the disappearance of Rachel. What I then expected to happen would be to find Rachel's body in the drain.
In the early hours of Wednesday the 1st of January 2003, 21-year-old Rachel Moran left her parents' house on the outskirts of Hull to walk the 1 mile distance back to her flat. But Rachel never reached her destination, and a massive search conducted by Humberside Police failed to reveal any new information until divers found her handbag in a nearby canal.
The possessions were wrapped in a black bin bag, and it told us that somebody had deliberately got rid of the property that Rachel had on her at the time, and it did give a far more sinister feel to the investigation.
When the family were told of the discovery, Rachel's mother Wanda couldn't help but speculate on what might have happened.
I didn't think for a second that anyone had thrown her in the water, but I just thought she must have been so distressed that night and overwrought that she'd gone to the drain and fallen in it. Not necessarily thrown herself in, but slipped in the dark, and I just felt totally guilty that maybe I could have done something to stop her doing that, you know, forced her back in the house.
And at that point, we thought that Rachel was probably dead. The next question is, where was she? And that was the difficulty, really. We hadn't found Rachel in the drain. We'd searched open land, burial sites, and again, it didn't really move us much further on into finding out what happened to Rachel.
While detectives attempted to trace a passerby who may have seen Rachel leaving her mother's house on the night she disappeared, Detective Superintendent Davison staged a reconstruction to refresh the memories of any potential witnesses.
We did have a police officer who had a resemblance to Rachel. She was wearing the same clothing, walking along the same route, to try and get someone to jog the memory, to see if they'd seen anything or if they'd seen Rachel on that night.
And a number of new witnesses came forward following the appeal.
We did get an excellent response, but it was New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, and some people had had a drink. The recollection wasn't as accurate on some occasions as it could have been.
However, the appeal also led to the recovery of a second batch of CCTV footage from a nearby school.
It was one Friday afternoon where a detective going through footage from CCTV asked me to come and look at an image on the screen. And he showed me this image on the screen, which was very difficult to see and understand what you're looking at. And he said, well, I think it's a female, and you could see light, which would be the head, then dark, then light. And he said, that's the head, that's the dress, and that's the legs. And I said, do you think that's Rachel? And he said, yes.
If the image on the screen was Rachel, she would have been only 150 metres from the front door of her flat.
That raised my hopes that could have been Rachel at that time, which meant significantly that she got to a certain point on Hall Road and may have gone a slightly different route home. The route that we anticipated she would have taken was brightly lit. However, the route she took led her into darkness, and from a female's perspective, put her in a much more vulnerable position.
This new find immediately provided the officers with a major new lead to investigate, and when they ran the tape on, the detectives made a startling discovery.
Following Rachel, there appeared to be another figure. Very difficult to tell again whether it's male or female. But the gap between the two wasn't very great. If Rachel had been murdered, that was possible a person that could have been involved.
As he considered his options, Detective Superintendent Davison realised that Rachel's disappearance could be at the hands of a stranger.
The likelihood is that, she's got to that point and disappeared. It could be a stranger abduction. And there aren't many in this country in any one year, very few, 2 or 3.
If Rachel's abductor was a random stranger, then the Humberside detective team faced a major new challenge.
If you're going to capture a stranger, a true stranger who's killed Rachel, then they are going to do everything possible, to evade detection.
The discovery of the new CCTV footage reinvigorated the investigation and gave the senior investigating officer an ambitious new idea.
But if a person is abducted on foot, 98% of the bodies are found within a half-mile radius of the last sighting, and 99% are found within a mile of the last sighting.
Based on that information, I made a decision to search all of those houses within a 1.5 mile radius, which means basically knocking on somebody's house and asking to come and search the house from top to bottom, including fridge, freezers, lofts, everything.
The operation would require over 100 officers to search every house in the vicinity and relied on the goodwill and cooperation of the Orchard Park residents.
The best I'd hoped for when I made that decision was that if she was in a garage or a car or a house, by going high profile in the media that I'm going to do this, that we would have Rachel's body dumped somewhere.
But if the operation failed, Detective Superintendent Davison would have wasted thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money.
It was a difficult concept for people to get their head around, particularly the officers who worked for me, and it was a decision which most people didn't agree with, because this would commit hundreds of officers every day to searching by consent.
Despite the concerns of a number of officers, the plan was put into action on Tuesday, the 28th of January.
We assembled, I think, 100 officers, and I did the briefing. I explained what I was going to do. And I've got to say that most people looked at me and thought, it's time they carted this guy off, really, because he's balmy.
In order to raise awareness of the operation and to assist in explaining the officers' objectives, Detective Superintendent Davison invited the television news cameras to observe the initial searches.
It was pouring down with rain, freezing cold. We knocked on the first door and a little old lady came. Then we asked to come in, and with the cameras rolling, she swore at us and slammed the door. And at that point my heart sank, because looking at what was happening in other streets, people were not in, not answering the doors. And I thought, what have I done? This is the worst decision I've ever made in my life, really.
Each team was made up of 2 police officers and a search specialist, and by lunchtime they had already inspected dozens of houses. But then Detective Superintendent Davison received an unexpected telephone call.
One of the incident room staff said, "You got a phone call." And he'd said it was a detective who was upset.
Believing that the officer had possibly had a run-in with an angry resident, Detective Superintendent Davison braced himself.
And so when I picked up the phone, it was just expecting that call, that it was a detective saying, "I'm not going to do this."
But instead, one of his officers had some vital information. PC Steve Dennison and his colleagues had been searching property close to Rachel's flat when they knocked on the door of number 19 Nash Court, the home of Michael Little.
Inside the address there was Mr. Little and a friend of his, and they knew what was going on in terms of what our presence was there as part of the high-profile publicised searching of addresses. It appeared to me that it was a flat for one person and his friend was merely visiting. Michael Little was willing to direct us around his house, to show us which was the living room, which was his bedroom.
The search didn't take long, and the officers were soon ready to leave.
Each flat has its own locked bin cupboard where they would maybe put the dustbin or a wheelie bin, and that was the last thing that we had to search before we left.
And so the police officers asked Michael for the keys to the cupboard.
At first he told us that he didn't have the key, or didn't know where the key was, but we pressed the point because we wanted to make sure that we did search that cupboard before we left to move on to the next address, and he suggested that the key might possibly be at his mother's house.
The police officers were puzzled.
It did seem a little strange that a guy wouldn't have the key to his own bin cupboard. So again, we pressed upon him further, kept asking him where the key was. Suddenly he was able to locate the key and unlock the door, and then he returned back into the flat. Inside the cupboard was a pile of rubbish, boxes, carpet, bin bags full of what I would presume is household waste.
The two men started to search the cupboard.
So I'd picked up an item of rubbish off the pile and I just placed it on the floor next to me. As I was doing that, another officer had reached in to pick up the next piece of rubbish, and I'd noticed that he wasn't moving, and I looked across and he was looking into the cupboard. And I looked at where he was looking, and that's when I saw a leg sticking up from the pile of rubbish.
And at the back of the tiny cupboard, the detectives found the body of Rachel Moran.
It was a shock. It was such a small space, and really I wouldn't have expected to have found a person or a body inside a space of that small size.
Realising that the two men sat in the flat could be involved, the police officers returned and immediately arrested them on suspicion of murder.
They both responded in a completely different way. Little's friend said something to the effect of, "Murder, what have you found in the cupboard?" Michael Little looked up and said words to the effect of, "He knows nothing about it." I got the impression that was a genuine response, that clearly the friend was as shocked as we were, and Little knew what was there, and he'd resigned himself to the fact that his fate had caught up with him.
The officers reported their findings to the investigation team and waited patiently for assistance.
We waited for transportation to come and take ourselves and the prisoners away from the scene, and the first vehicle arrived and one of my colleagues took away Little's friend.
As PC Dennison and his prisoner waited alone in the small flat, Michael Little started to talk.
He was in a position, I presume, where he felt he needed to get it off his chest as to what had happened. He'd bottled it up for a month, and now he'd been caught. He clearly wanted to disclose information to me.
PC Dennison reminded Little of his rights before recording the confession in his notebook.
These are quotes. "I'm so glad you found her. I've wanted to tell someone for ages. It's such a weight off my chest. I saw all the police stuff on the news and just hoped they came here. I've not told anybody else. Nobody knows." He said, "I can't be a normal person doing this. I must be evil or something. I saw her that night walking alone, so I went over and spoke to her. She came back here for a drink and we chatted for a while, but ended up arguing. I think I walked out of the room or something, and when I came back, she'd gone to the kitchen and was stood at the side with her back to me. When I went near her, she turned around and I saw a small knife in her hand. She slashed out at me and cut me on my arm."
PC Dennison was stunned.
It's a difficult situation, so all you can do is try and be as professional as you can and record it as closely as you can.
And the news that Rachel's body had been discovered spread quickly.
I personally felt relieved. I didn't even think of the horror of it and anything else. I just thought, thank God they found her. And we can get her back. We can have her home, and she's not going to be somewhere forever and never found. And I would have found that really hard to live with. Ray said he would have preferred that. If he could keep thinking in his heart of hearts, well, she could be alive.
In my own mind, I was hoping that nothing particular had happened that had been particularly bad. But that was the end of my hopes. And I just remember going into a back room and just standing looking out the window. And my dad came through, and I just remember my dad and me just hugging each other.
It was a mixture of tremendous sadness for the family, but professional elation, I guess, in terms of we've found Rachel, which is the aim of the searches. We have 2 in custody for murder, so you've actually got the killers probably in the scene of where it happened, which was far, far more than I could ever have hoped for when I intended to begin the searches.
But everyone was left asking one question. Who is Michael Little? Four weeks after disappearing as she walked home from her parents' house, Rachel Moran's body was found in a storage cupboard in an apartment block near her home. As police officers descended on the scene, the key holder immediately confessed to killing Rachel in self-defense during an argument. And when the senior investigating officer arrived, even he was shocked by what he found.
The flat was best I could describe as squalid, really.
The detective looked in the storage cupboard.
Rachel was at the bottom of the cupboard and wrapped in a duvet, in a fetal position. A really upsetting scene, really. I actually touched Rachel's leg because she didn't look real. She looked like a mannequin, really.
Whilst the pathologist and the forensic teams worked to retrieve both Rachel's body and any significant evidence, PC Dennison arrived at Queen's Gardens Police Station with his prisoner Michael Little.
I asked him if he could read through the specific phrases and admissions that he told me whilst we was together at the flat.
Other than one or two minor points, Little agreed that the notes were accurate and signed them to authenticate his account.
What's rare in these cases is not so much that someone admits to an offence, but when it's put on paper and presented to that person, that they stand by their admission.
The investigation immediately focused on learning more about their suspects, with the detectives paying particular attention to Michael Little.
He was a man in his early 20s. He was grossly overweight. He did suffer from some depression, which he was receiving some medication for. He seems to have accepted his life as unemployed and on benefits, and he used to spend a lot of his time in his flat, either watching pornography, smoking cannabis, or drinking.
And his friends revealed that Little openly fantasised about having relationships with women.
They talked about Little speaking about a girlfriend that he'd had, but none of them believed him, because none of them thought that he'd ever had a girlfriend because of his inability to speak to women when they were out together.
But it was the description of Little's mystery girlfriend that concerned the police. She was supposedly slim, blonde, and over 6 feet tall, just like Rachel.
He used to spend a vast amount of time in his flat, just looking out the window, just looking at people going past. And with Rachel living so close by, we believe that he'd been looking out of his window, he'd seen Rachel going about a normal daily business, and he'd maybe been looking at her and fantasising about her.
The detectives investigating Rachel's murder also started to verify Michael Little's alibi for the early hours of New Year's Day.
He went out hoping for a good evening, met up with some friends, but got a knock back from a girl he fancied, and one of his friends went off with that female, and so he would have felt upset at that, I think.
Little then bumped into another friend who invited him to a party which he stayed at until just after midnight.
We believe that he then decided to walk home, still feeling the aggression at being knocked back.
And when detectives traced the route Little used to walk home, they realised he was the passerby they'd been trying to find.
Coincidentally and tragically, he walked past Mrs. Moran and Rachel as they were talking outside Mrs. Moran's home address.
He may well have heard Rachel say, "I'm going to walk home because my boyfriend's gone out and left the kittens." And Michael Little may have formed the opinion that that would have been his chance to follow Rachel along Hall Road.
We'd gone back to the CCTV, and it was clear that the person that was 3 minutes in front of Rachel walking down Hall Road was indeed Michael Little.
But the figure seen in the second CCTV clip ran up behind Rachel, a fact which in itself revealed a disturbing truth.
Based on that sequence where we've got him ahead of Rachel and then a switch round, Rachel ahead of him later on, That again suggests to me that he was kind of waiting, hanging around, and this was some degree of premeditation to what he subsequently did.
Although no murder weapon was found, the post-mortem immediately revealed how Rachel had been killed.
The cause of death was severe and multiple stab wounds to the back, and one or two were so forceful they'd come through to the front of Rachel.
Rachel had been stabbed from behind 27 times, and the pathologist also noted that there were no signs of any defensive wounds.
It tended to suggest to us that there'd been no struggle and that he'd stabbed her from behind, and she had absolutely no knowledge of it, really.
The discovery of dried mud on the back of Rachel's legs helped detectives piece together what had happened the night she died.
Well, it suggested to me that she'd been dragged across the grass against her will. Maybe he had his hand over her mouth so she wouldn't be screaming, and then dragged Rachel into the flat where he lived.
Forensic analysis confirmed that Rachel had been in Little's flat.
There was blood from Rachel inside the flat, not just in the cupboard on the landing. And based on the amount of blood and the distribution, that she was killed in the hallway.
Although Little claimed to have acted in self-defence, there was no forensic evidence to substantiate his story.
He said Rachel attacked him with a small knife and cut him on the arm, but there was never any injury. He was examined and there wasn't a cut to his arm.
These revelations allowed the detectives to piece together their own theory of how events unfolded during Rachel's final moments.
Based on what we know of Michael Little, he maybe couldn't believe his luck that he came across Rachel walking home in a very vulnerable state and possibly tried to befriend her. Knowing Rachel, as we kind of do now, her background, she would have had none of it.
The detectives believe this second rejection of the evening pushed Little to breaking point.
Michael Little, I think, abducted Rachel, dragged her into the flat and killed her, and then put her into the cupboard, wrapped in a duvet. At some point, though, he got rid of Rachel's or some of Rachel's belongings and dumped them in the river, which we subsequently found.
The combination of Little's confession and the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming.
It was the worst kind of coincidence you can think of, really, and Michael Little was probably the last person, the most dangerous person Rachel would have come across that evening. If she'd come to the gate with a mother a minute later, then Michael Little would have been in front of her. A minute here, a minute there, it wouldn't have happened.
Convinced of his guilt, detectives charged Michael Little with the murder of Rachel Moran on Friday the 31st of January 2003. Meanwhile, detectives found no evidence to connect Michael Little's friend to Rachel's murder, and he was released from police custody unconditionally. Rachel's funeral took place 4 weeks later, and the Moran family continued to mourn her tragic death. However, a new revelation would torment the family further. Swabs taken during the post-mortem revealed that Little had had sexual intercourse with Rachel.
The decision I had to take is whether to arrest Michael Little for rape of Rachel, even though he was already charged with murder. But I decided not to, based on the fact that I really didn't know whether Rachel was alive or dead when he had intercourse with her.
I was totally convinced that's what he'd been aiming for to start with, and that she'd probably spurned his advances, and that's when he'd totally lost it. But that's no consolation, is it?
The trial of Michael Little took place over 3 weeks, and on the 30th of October 2003, he was found guilty of murdering Rachel Moran. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to serve a minimum of 25 years. But the trial failed to reveal exactly how or why Michael Little was driven to murder Rachel Moran, and so her family are left with questions that will never be answered.
So all she wanted to do was get back to feed her kittens, and purely by chance this monster she came upon, Michael Little, took her life away in the most brutal circumstances.
You know, Rachel did have everything to look forward to, And he had done nothing with his life. He'd done absolutely nothing. And the only thing he's done is destructively take away Rachel Moran.
I remember playing with her as a little girl in the garden, going to school, and then later on we had a few nights where we'd gone out together. And then I remember last night, as clear as day. But then I can't reconcile that with what happened just a couple of hours later. It's almost something I don't want to believe because my sister's not here anymore.
You would hate to think it was somebody who knew her, or she was close to, or cared about her, and she cared about them. So in a way, there is some kind of comfort in knowing it was a stranger, but at the same time, it does absolutely infuriate you to think that someone thought they had the right to do that to someone who they didn't even know, and it didn't matter. You know, it didn't matter to that person that she was somebody's kid, you know, and somebody's sister, and it just didn't give a second thought that night.